Hello, I am Dr. Mirela Cerneanu, and I welcome you to the Wellness Optimizing Warrior MD podcast, the WOW MD podcast. I am not your typical wellness coach, and this is not a typical wellness podcast. Here, I'll discuss educational facts about health, hormones, intimacy, anti-aging, and beauty trends, all very hot topics, to empower you to make great choices when it comes to your health and to your body. I want you to go, wow, I did not know that. Or, wow, this is going to make a great difference for me. Our healthcare system is broken and it needs a revolution. You and I can start one today. I am willing to share my knowledge with the world if you're willing to listen. Let's get started. Welcome, listeners, to episode 5, all about progesterone, part 2. In this podcast, I'd like to discuss more facts about progesterone, and I will address the following issues here. Number 1, I'll talk a little bit about menstruation, why cycles happen, how they happen, and how progesterone is important for the menstruation process. Then I would like to talk about when to test our sex hormones, the estrogen and the progesterone. What is the timing and what to look for? Then we'll talk about what happens with our cycles as we age and how the estrogen-progesterone balance is changing. And also the value of progesterone after menopause in balancing estrogen replacement hormones. And last but not least, I'd like for you to know the difference between progestins, the fake synthetic progesterone-like chemicals, and the body's own bioidentical hormones. So I'll spend some time discussing that. And I will end discussing possible side effects with progesterone treatment. So let's get started with a little review of how a woman gets a period. This is a recap from what I discussed in the last episode. So to get a period naturally, the brain will release gonadotropic hormone, which talks to the pituitary, and it tells the pituitary to release FSH and LH. These two pituitary hormones now act on the ovary. FSH is promoting follicular growth, estrogen, and LH stimulates the tissue between the follicles, making testosterone. These two hormones, FSH and LH, needs to be balanced just right. And FSH recruits baby eggs that exist in the follicles, and one of these will become larger, dominate, will make estrogen, then it will ovulate by releasing the egg, and the remnant eggshell will become the corpus luteum, which is the part of the ovary that now makes the progesterone. Now that I've explained what happens in the ovary, let's move on to what happens inside the uterus with the estrogen and the progesterone. What are their actions on the uterus? What does estrogen do to the uterus, and what does progesterone do to the uterus? Remember, estrogen is a proliferating hormone that makes things grow. The lining of the uterus will grow under the effect of estrogen. Estrogen makes other things grow too. The lining of the uterus, the breast tissue, the vaginal tissues. And this is important to keep in mind because without estrogen, those tissues that I mentioned that are very estrogen sensitive, the uterus, the breasts, the vaginal tissues will suffer, will actually become thinner, smaller. They will shrink. They will be pretty much dried up. It's a tough thing to go through, and that's actually what happens in menopause. But more about that in the future. So estrogen makes the uterine lining, the mucosa inside the uterus called the endometrium, grow every month. The uterus is largely composed of muscle tissue. The uterine lining inside the uterine cavity does not exist normally anywhere else. When this uterine lining called endometrium spreads outside the uterus, that is called endometriosis. When the uterine lining cells grow inside the uterine muscle wall, that is called adenomyosis or endometriosis of the uterus. Remember I said estrogen makes things grow, especially the uterine lining. So estrogen, unfortunately, can make endometriosis and adenomyosis grow as well. What else does estrogen promote growth of? Well, estrogen can make fibroids grow. Fibroids are benign tumors that form inside the uterus. Estrogen has a growth effect, and it's not good when you have fibroids. Again, this could be the subject for another podcast in the future. But let's continue with the effect of estrogen and progesterone on the uterine lining. So let's come back to the analogy or metaphor I used earlier when I asked you to imagine the uterine lining as a brick wall in the last episode. So this is helpful for you to create a visual that's easy to understand and easy to remember. Again, imagine the lining of the uterus or the endometrium as a brick wall. The bricks that keep piling one on top of the other to build the wall are the estrogen, and that happens with estrogen only. So estrogen equals bricks, and more estrogen equals more bricks stacked one on top of the other, creating a wall. So estrogen equals growth inside the uterus. I don't have to be extremely descriptive, but please imagine that a brick wall with bricks on top of bricks that's very tall. It's almost like a house made of cards. Without any mortar, it will be very unstable and very prone to crashing or crumbling very easily. All you have to do is blow on it. Imagine in order to stabilize that wall, you will need to come in and put the mortar on top of the wall and all along the wall that not only stops the wall from growing, but the mortar will solidify the wall and make it stable. Imagine the mortar is progesterone. So again, estrogen equals bricks, progesterone equals mortar. Coming back to the uterine lining and the brick wall with the mortar analogy, let me also explain that in case you have progesterone, but not enough, your wall might be very tall and somewhat stable, but weak. It could still crumble anytime. So we need two things to maintain the wall. We need estrogen, the bricks, and the mortar, which is progesterone. And if we don't have enough progesterone, the wall can crumble. And if suddenly the body stops making estrogen and putting bricks on top of bricks, the wall will also, interestingly enough, crumble too. And if the wall crumbles or breaks down, we start to bleed. So two things need to happen for women to have a period. They either run out of estrogen or they run out of progesterone to keep the wall from being stable. Most of the times with the normal ovulatory cycle, when a viable egg is being released of good quality, but there is no implantation of an embryo into the uterine lining, the corpus luteum that makes the progesterone simply runs out. It stops making the two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and you now will shed the uterine lining and the cycle will start all over again. So interestingly enough, many women, when they experience a traumatic emotional event where they go through an extremely stressful time that comes unexpectedly, they might get a period for no reason. That is most likely because the stress interferes with the hormonal production from the ovary. It will impact it and it will decrease the amount of either estrogen or progesterone available to maintain the wall inside the uterus. So if this happens, you will get a period unexpectedly. So this is how stress causes bleeding. Stress will interfere and possibly suppress estrogen production. It could actually interrupt a normal ovulation, or it can negate and interrupt a normal corpus luteum function. And the wall inside the uterus that has been built up will crash and you'll get a period. So estrogen makes cells and tissues grow. And unfortunately, without progesterone, these cells can grow and proliferate. And if that happens for months or years, this proliferation growth process can spin out of control. The stimulating effect of the estrogen can and will cause abnormalities in the quality of the process that allows the cells to divide and multiply. This is called mitosis. These abnormalities in the mitosis division process, unfortunately, is how atypia develops. These atypical cells are not normal. So the cellular multiplication and division process for these cells becomes abnormal. And unfortunately, this is the first step that leads to cancer. So our job as OBGYNs is to balance the estrogen effect on the uterus and regulate a menstrual cycle in a woman. But a woman's job as a patient is to understand that estrogen only without progesterone is not good for long term and can lead to serious problems, including a possibly increased risk of cancer, which is why any suspected abnormality of periods that persists for more than a few months should really be looked into and addressed by a doctor. An ultrasound is needed to rule out pathology like cysts, fibroids, and polyps. And very importantly, we need to check the hormones. So next topic I'd like to talk about is when to test our estrogen and progesterone. Well, I kind of gave out the clue in all the discussion I did earlier about how the cycle happens and when there's ovulation, when there's progesterone. However, I'll break it down and go slow. If you're experiencing menstrual cycles that happen regularly, you ideally want to have your blood tested at peak luteal phase, which is midway between ovulation and your next period. That's about a week before your next cycle is due and your period is scheduled to start. That is the peak hormone level for both estrogen and progesterone during the luteal phase. So let me remind you that the woman starts her cycle on the first day of her period. After the period ends, she enters the follicular phase when estrogen continues to be produced more and more to a peak. That's the top of estrogen production, the highest level. That's on day 12 to 14. This coincides with ovulation. If ovulation happens, then the woman will enter the luteal phase, where the ovary now produces progesterone. That is mainly to prepare the uterine lining for implantation. In case implantation does not happen, after 10 to 14 days of progesterone and estrogen, the body knows it stops producing both hormones, the lining of the uterus will shed, period will start, will last a few days, and the cycle starts all over again with another period. So if we want to know if a woman has ovulated, we can either check her on day 14 and look to see if there's a LH surge, which is a whole other thing that we can talk about. But this is all about progesterone. Or we can check 1 week later after ovulation to see how much progesterone has been produced. That is the key time to assess estrogen-progesterone ratio. And that is the 21st day of the cycle in a woman that has 28-day cycle. Well, what if you don't have a 28-day cycle? What if your cycle is 35 days or 40 days? Subtract from the duration of your cycle 7 to 8 days, and then schedule your blood draw a week before your menstruation is supposed to start. Having an app that tracks your periods will be very useful in this circumstance. So coming back to checking hormones, if we check hormones in the first week of the cycle, it's useful if we want to know early on how high the estrogen is. Because if the estrogen is too high and the FSH is too high in the first couple of days of the cycle, that is a great indicator for ovarian reserve decline. So that means that a woman is running out of eggs. So checking hormones in the first week of the period tells us a completely different thing. And it will not make any sense to test for progesterone because there will be no progesterone in the body except a very small amount, which is produced by the adrenal. Checking estrogen during the second week of the cycle, before or right around ovulation, it is useful to tell you how high does the body's estrogen level is. It will not tell you anything about estrogen and progesterone balance. So if you're serious about knowing whether or not you're estrogen dominant, please ask your doctor to check your hormone level on day 20, 21, or 22 of your cycle, if you have a 28-day cycle. And again, if your cycle is longer, check your hormones 1 week before your scheduled period is supposed to start. So I talked a lot about fertile ovulatory cycles, and I explained how estrogen is balanced by progesterone. So this is very clear for women that are fertile and make eggs and have great ovarian reserve. But what happens to older women in perimenopause? Well, a key thing to know if you're over 40 is that as a woman approaches menopause, she starts running out of good quality eggs. And that doesn't happen 1 or 2 years before menopause. That starts happening 10 years or more before menopause. The quality of the eggs will decline with age. So the eggs are, so to speak, weaker. So the amount of progesterone that is produced is much lower. However, nature is very smart. And usually in most women, estrogen also declines. And it's much lower than during the woman's peak fertile years. So the body does try to keep a balance naturally. So what I mean by that is that when you're young and fertile, if you check your estrogen level around ovulation, most likely that could be as high as 200 or 300. But if you check it around ovulation, as you're in your early, mid, late 40s, your estrogen level could be 80, 90, 100, 120, which is much lower than when you were younger. Again, the eggs are weaker. There will be less estrogen, so less progesterone. And this is probably how the body tries to keep this balance naturally. Unfortunately, by now, most perimenopausal women are likely extremely stressed, either due to teenage children problems, career issues, job and family responsibilities, aging parents, and in these circumstances, cortisol production due to stress will do what? Well, will increase the chance of a lower progesterone situation. Number one, no ovulation, which means no progesterone because of stress. And number two, possibly due to the progesterone steal, because now your adrenal needs to make all the stress hormone to deal with the stress. The body will use the progesterone to make cortisol. Also, what might be important to know is that the constant stress during perimenopause, and that's a reality, all perimenopause women are stressed. This constant stress damages the delicate intestinal lining and the quality of the microbiome, which is the gut bacteria. This unfortunately leads to SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or other functional issues with estrogen elimination causing estrogen dominance. This easily explains why women in the perimenopause years, instead of having lighter periods from lower estrogen, suffer from a worsening of their periods. They suddenly have heavy, long, and painful periods, sometimes requiring procedures like an endometrial ablation or hysterectomy. Treating women with progesterone early on can help and drastically reduce these symptoms, avoiding unnecessary surgical procedures. So let's talk a little bit about women at menopause that are on hormone replacement. There is a common misperception within the OBGYN world that if a woman is at menopause and she requires estrogen replacement, if she doesn't have a uterus, there's no need for progesterone. And this is how most OBGYNs look at a woman's body. You have a hysterectomy after menopause, you need estrogen, you probably don't need to bother with progesterone. That is not entirely true, as many women get major improvement in various symptoms after menopause by using progesterone. There's many studies and reports about how progesterone balances the proliferative effect estrogen has on breast tissue, which makes it a cancer protector and a very essential hormone to maintain breast health. But bottom line, if you're a woman in menopause and are using estrogen replacement and have a uterus, you will need to also replace progesterone. Remember, without estrogen, we will not make progesterone. If you introduce estrogen from the outside as replacement, you will now need to introduce progesterone from the outside as well. These hormones go hand in hand. Please do not take estrogen without progesterone. At menopause, we don't make any more estrogen. We have to replace it if we want to feel good. If you replace estrogen only and forget to take the progesterone or do not understand the importance of taking progesterone, your uterine lining will grow unchecked. will shed randomly, creating breakthrough bleeding. It might even give you the false sense of, oh, I just have a regular normal period. But that is not a regular normal period. You don't get your periods back by replacing estrogen without progesterone. You create a situation that can increase your risk of atypia, which can lead to cancer. Also, without estrogen, there is no wall building on its own inside the uterus. There will be no uterine lining. I want to explain this because a lot of women are confused as to why they bleed. Let me ask you this question and have you imagine this scenario. If you take progesterone only, are you going to bleed? Well, think about the analogy I used before. The progesterone is the mortar. So if you take mortar and you spread it on the ground, do you now have a wall? Well, no, you don't. So again, do not be confused about why you bleed. If you take estrogen and then you add progesterone, you don't bleed because you took the progesterone. You are bleeding because you took the estrogen and now you're adding the progesterone, creating the balance and allowing the mortar to work on the wall for 10 to 14 days, and then the wall will crumble by itself. So, to be clear, progesterone does not cause any bleeding in the absence of estrogen. If there is no estrogen and you take progesterone, there will be no bleeding. Now, there's a whole different situation to where you don't make any estrogen, but you take progesterone, and suddenly, because your body feels better, or maybe because you replace progesterone, there's some random estrogen production. In that case, there will be breakthrough bleeding. So if you're a woman at menopause or perimenopause, and you take progesterone as a replacement, 10 days a month, 14 days a month, to balance the estrogen, either the one that you make on your own or the one that you replace as estrogen replacement, you will get a period. And if your body produces estrogen naturally, if you take progesterone, you will balance the estrogen and get a period. If your body stops making estrogen, or the ovary has trouble responding to the brain because there are much fewer eggs remaining, and these eggs are of poor quality, and there's no estrogen coming from the outside, but you bring in the progesterone, there will be no bleeding. If there is no estrogen produced when you stop the progesterone, you will not have a period. Usually at perimenopause, if the doctor will give you progesterone to make you feel better or to balance your period, not having a period when you stop progesterone, it's a sign that's very easily interpreted. Most likely you didn't have any estrogen. So your estrogen is low or non-existent at this point. Now, keep in mind, for perimenopause women that might still ovulate randomly, you could miraculously be pregnant. That can still happen during perimenopause. It's rare, but not impossible. So please keep that in mind. So coming back to how to take progesterone when we want to balance estrogen after menopause. Many OBGYN doctors will advise menopausal women who use estrogen to take progesterone daily to avoid a period. I personally have an entire different philosophy, and I'll talk more about that in a future podcast where I address menopause management and the benefits of using progesterone cyclically as nature intended us to when we used to have normal cycles. I don't personally believe taking progesterone daily is as safe as we think it is. And the body's not meant to be exposed to progesterone 30 days every month for years on end. I believe progesterone is intended to be released 10 to 14 days a month, and the body did that for maybe 40 years. If we want to replace things and bring it as close to as nature used to do it, then why give the body progesterone every day? And there are other pros and cons I will talk about in the future. I'd like to move on and discuss the difference between actual progesterone and progestins. And hopefully you made it through this entire podcast and you're still listening, because this is a really important key point that I'd like to educate you about. There's a big difference between progesterone and progestins. Don't be fooled. They might sound similar, but they're not. Progesterone is your own hormone made by your body from cholesterol. Progestyn is a fake synthetic hormone, a chemical hormone that has a molecular structure similar to progesterone, sometimes remotely similar. For example, a Progestyn might be called medroxyprogesterone acetate, which means that the progesterone molecule has a medroxy and an acetate compounds attached to it. Or it might be called something like desogestrel, levonorgestrel, norethindrone, etonogestrel, because the chemical structure is so different than progesterone, it just has a different name. The progestins are used in birth control pills, IUDs, and the birth control shot. In the past, they were also frequently used in hormone replacement therapy. I hope no OBGYNs are using progestins to balance estrogen for women at menopause. If your doctor is doing that, please change physicians. Progesterone is a natural hormone made by the body for a specific purpose, to balance your estrogen. Progestins are synthetic chemicals made by Big Pharma to mimic the effect of progesterone in the body. They connect to the progesterone receptors, disrupt them, and cause a partial effect and some other effects that are not completely understood or known that are very different than progesterone effects. So progestin are progesterone receptor disruptors. Please remember this. So let's talk a little bit about what does progesterone do and what do progestins do for different processes in the body. Well, progesterone regulates ovulation and promotes and supports implantation of the embryo. We talked about this for the past 2 episodes. It is critical in sustaining a normal pregnancy. It's keeping the uterus calm for 9 months. It is essential to maintain the pregnancy. However, administering synthetic progestins during a pregnancy can increase risk of fetal abnormalities. Very, very different. Progesterone is a secretory hormone balancing the proliferating effects estrogen has on the uterus and the breast. It's the mortar that comes on the wall and stops it from growing and solidifies it. Progestins thin out the lining of the uterus drastically. It's a very different effect. And they increase breast cancer risk, most likely because they are hormone disruptors. More about hormone disruptors and cancer in a future podcast, but remember this word, hormone disruptors. Progesterone alleviates and helps anxiety. It promotes calmness. Progestins do not. Progesterone is an essential master hormone made in small amounts in the adrenal gland that serves as a precursor for cortisol, our stress hormones. Progestins introduced in the body do not convert into a natural hormone like progesterone does. They simply latch on to progesterone receptors, activating them. Progesterone lowers blood pressure, while progestins raise blood pressure. Progesterone has many non-reproductive effects on the human body, like neuroprotection from excitotoxins and after brain trauma. It helps raise the seizure threshold and help seizure control in women with seizure disorder. On the other hand, progestin use has been linked to brain fog and negative effects on cognition. Progesterone promotes bone formation by stimulating osteoblasts, the cells that make new bone, and it does so in conjunction with estrogen. On the other side, progestins increase osteoporosis risk. For example, the depot shot, the birth control shot, has a black box warning, which is the highest, most serious adverse event warning the FDA can assign to a drug, that clearly states that the use of this medication can lead to serious bone loss that might be irreversible. The use of the depot shot in young women is limited to maximum 2 years. Please keep in mind, we do have healthier alternatives to birth control. So when a woman is forming her bone mass, using this drug, this medication for 2 years will significantly impact her health and prevent her from achieving a peak bone density, which is crucial for older age. because it increases the risk of osteoporosis. So just for the sake of it, try running a search on Google using the words Progestyn and osteoporosis. There is a ton of entries that literally use the word progesterone in this search that pops up. Every single title entry might be about benefits of progesterone. You just ran a search on Progestyn and osteoporosis. Why does Google pull up entries about progesterone? Does Google want us to think that progestins and progesterone are the same? Let me tell you something else that's very interesting. Every search on the internet about progesterone pulls up a ton of references about progestins instead. So if you search for entries like, what are progestins' side effects or what are progestins' risks? There's a lot of entries that discuss progesterone, not progestins. And when you search for what do progestins do to the female body, there's a lot of entries discussing progesterone instead. And you might also find the term progestogen. Like, that's not confusing enough. Now we have another word to describe progestins. And this new word is very similar to progesterone. A lot of postings on the World Wide Web seem to use the term progesterone and progestyn interchangeably, creating a lot of confusion. I was doing some research, came across an article published in 2012 in the Atlantic publication entitled How Progestyn, a Female Synthetic Hormone, Could Affect the Brain. In this article, terms progestyn and progesterone are used interchangeably, sometimes in the same paragraph, which, for example, could start talking about the benefits of progestins, but goes on to say that the studies have used micronized progesterone, which is actually real progesterone, bioidentical, just synthetically made. I personally, as a physician, know the difference between progesterone and progestyn very well, but most people do not. Most women do not. And there's a huge difference between progesterone and progestins. They might be similar in structure because otherwise they wouldn't work. They wouldn't connect to the progesterone receptors. But they're very different. Remember all the things I told you before and all the actions that progesterone does and progestins do not do or do opposite effects. Big Pharma decided to synthesize progesterone-like substances because initially the cost of bioidentical progesterone was very high. So these progestins were initially developed to overcome production costs. And there was also some concern that the half-life of progesterone is very short after being administered to the body. So they wanted something that lasts longer, especially for birth control purposes. And this is why modern medicine started using progestins instead of progesterone. I want you to know and to remember that progestins are not progesterones. Progestins are synthetic, chemical, look-alike progesterone wannabes that connect to the progesterone receptors, partially activate them, and literally disrupt them. The only purpose and use for progestins in modern medicine is now birth control. There should be no use for them in menopause management because we know the risks and side effects with using progestins are much higher than using progesterone. A woman that uses progestins for menopausal hormone replacement has a much higher increased risk of blood clots, stroke, heart attack, dementia, and breast cancer. Again, remember, and this is my personal name, I call progestins fake synthetic progesterone wannabes. And I really hope medicine adopts a more clear term for them and actually calls them what they are, progesterone disruptors. So coming back to progesterone, I want to end the podcast by touching on progesterone replacement side effects. And I want to talk a little bit about women who do not tolerate or have side effects with progesterone. My theory and opinion is that women who have not had progesterone in a very long time, but are given progesterone and have trouble with it, is probably because their receptors are so avid for progesterone that normal doses will probably cause an overstimulation of these receptors. What do progesterone side effects look like? Well, the progesterone side effects most likely would manifest as breast tenderness, water retention, bloating, severe fatigue and grogginess in the morning when a woman wakes up, as the progesterone taken at bedtime continues to linger. And those are the most common side effects. Another theory is that maybe these women have used progestins throughout their lifespan for birth control for many years. And their body's receptors for progesterone are actually really excited to see natural progesterone again. And they're being overstimulated. That's just an opinion. Again, not a theory, not a medical fact. But what's a medical fact is that these women exist. There are women who absolutely hate progesterone, which is a problem because if you're a woman at menopause and you need estrogen, not being able to tolerate progesterone, it's a problem. So the truth is that if women use lower dose progesterone, the more they use it, the better they feel. These side effects can lessen over time. They might end up developing more tolerance to progesterone, which is important because remember, estrogen and progesterone need to come together as a package. Likely the same mechanism applies to women who have not had estrogen for years and suddenly get exposed to estrogen, which explains why women have suddenly bad side effects at using estrogen. Their receptors are likely extremely excited about seeing estrogen again. They're overstimulated, causing an overreaction, leading to changes in the body that are experienced as side effects and negatively. So, as a side note, a woman who reacts poorly to the bioidentical synthetic progesterone made by Big Pharma might actually react better to a bioidentical compounded progesterone derived from Mexican yams that comes in a cleaner capsule without the synthetic ingredients that are present in the micronized progesterone and in a lesser dose. Big Pharma makes progesterone in only 2 available doses: micronized progesterone, 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams. When we compound progesterone from a compounding pharmacy, we can start at 25 milligrams, 50, 75, 125, 130. We can play with progesterone whichever way we want. This is why compounded therapy is personalized and can be personalized, whereas Big Pharma synthetic progesterone, you only have 2 options, 100 or 200. If a woman has side effects to oral progesterone, which is the way we OBGYNs mainly recommend progesterone, keep in mind such women might love transdermal progesterone. That has to be compounded. But more about that in a future podcast when I explain hormone replacement therapy and how estrogen and progesterone can be replaced and what's ideal and so on and so forth. So coming back to hormone replacement and hormone support, keep in mind that is not easy. And physicians involved in the care of women who need hormone replacement need to leave preconceived notions behind and accept that a woman's body is unique and different. And women will experience the same hormone completely different in their bodies. So no 2 women are alike. And keeping that in mind makes the difference between physicians who are successful and make people happy with hormone replacement therapy versus physicians who put everybody in a box and are not interested in personalizing the treatment. Again, all hormone replacement therapy has to be individualized. And stay tuned as I will dedicate an entire podcast to hormone replacement therapy and talk more about this topic in the future. There might be more to come about these 2 key hormones in future podcasts, estrogen and progesterone. Their perfect balance is crucial to maintaining a woman's health. And imbalances of these 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone, causes a multitude of disease and problems for women. So I'll end here, but please join me next week when I talk about testosterone in women. You do not want to miss this podcast. I really promise to wow you with some great information you probably did not know about testosterone in women. I'll see you next week. If you liked the information you heard and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and follow my podcast. Should you find the content helpful to not just you, but possibly others, please share it and feel free to leave us a review. You are welcome to join the Facebook group, The Warrior Optimizing Wellness MD. I certainly hope that you've heard many things in this podcast that made you go, wow, I did not know that, or wow, I'd like to know more. So keep listening and I'll keep talking.